How many of you have ever heard the radio program called Fiasco? See the billboards around town? Anybody ever listen to it? Well, I was in the gym this week, and a couple of young guys, a couple of young worldly guys had arrived there before me, and so they had the radio turned up in the workout room to about 105 decibels. Therefore drowning out all jet engine noises. And then it was on this radio station, and these disc jockeys were talking in very crude fashion sometimes, but they were talking about the response to the big hurricane and all the devastation. And they decided to engage themselves and the public in a discussion about whether or not someone should take a hurricane victim into their home and provide them temporary lodging. And I just thought it was so interesting because they were going back and forth, and it was all a theoretical conversation, because you know that none of these people were ever going to do a single lick of anything to actually help any of these people. So it was all this theoretical discussion about whether or not they should provide any help. And you see a lot of that. This morning what I want us to do is I want us to take a look at the life of Paul, because he's a man, when he begins to discuss something we should do or should not do, he's not bringing it to us from a theoretical perspective. He is a man who was in the game. Our series here is How to Win the Battle for Your Soul. And this morning, the message is entitled, Challenge Men to Imitate Paul's Leadership and Life. And so we are doing this series to help ourselves, but we're also doing this series so that we can turn around and then go out and help other men understand how to live for Christ. This will be the outline. First of all, we'll just talk a little bit about our own leadership. I'll just call that, but I'm not a leader. And then we'll take a look at what made Paul tick as a leader from the text, and then we'll talk a little bit about what this looks like in practice today. I cannot remember my parents, and I'm not saying they didn't say things, but I actually don't remember my parents ever saying anything to encourage me as a leader or about becoming a man. I just don't have any recollection. I'm not saying they didn't do it. I just don't have any recollection of it. I don't have any recollection of them ever doing anything or saying anything to discourage me either. They just, basically, we were not a verbal family. And so whatever you picked up, you kind of had to pick up by osmosis. And so as a result of that, I always had inside of me a desire to do things that leaders do, but I never, ever felt comfortable having somebody refer to me as a leader until I was well into my 40s. Well into my 40s. By contrast, my son, when he filled out his application for college, he was asked to describe himself, and he put in the application as his self-description the words, quiet leader. Quietly, I was pretty taken with that. So I went to him and I said, where did you get this from? He said, I just made it up. I thought maybe he'd read it in a book or something. But isn't it interesting that when you tell young people, you can do this, you can be a man, you're a man, you can be a leader, you're a leader, you can lead, you can do this, that people get it. People get it. So, how about you? How about you? If I came up to you right now and said, you're a great leader, or you're going to be a great leader, or you can be a great leader, how would that make you? How do you respond to that? Do you find that agreeable? Do you find that awkward or uncomfortable? Is it true? Is it something that you want for yourself? Is it something that you used to think might happen, but now you've kind of given up on it? Do you want to be a leader? Well, I'm here to tell you, in the name of Jesus Christ, you can do this. You can be a leader. Christ wants you to be a leader. But I'm not a leader. Any man in this room who wants to can be a leader. The Bible actually defines leadership. We'll get to it later in this series, but it's 1 Corinthians 12:28. Leaders are those who are able to get other people to work together. And so if you have two people in your family, you and a woman, or you and a woman and some kids, and then you have a leadership role. Of course, you can do that well or not so well, but you have a leadership role. You have a charge to get other people to work together. Maybe you are a manager. Maybe you have some people working under you. And not only do you need to manage those people, but you have the need to be able to lead those people. Or it might be that you are a worker, but among co-workers, from time to time, you have a little task force, a little committee. And there is a need for leadership just everywhere. There is a tremendous need for leaders. In fact, a lot of people today who comment on leadership do believe that we are in a leadership deficit, that we don't have enough leaders. So let's take a look at what makes Paul tick as a leader. Let's look at 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And let's go through the text and find out what's going on here. In the last chapter, the big idea was, anybody remember? I'm responsible not to do what I am free to do if it causes you to sin. So I'm responsible not to do what I'm free to do if it causes you to sin. And so you see this idea in Paul of there's a greater good. There's a greater good that he's after. And so the last verse of chapter 8 says, if what I eat causes my brother to fall into sin, by the way, notice it doesn't say my casual acquaintance to fall into sin. This is, you don't have to go around living your life for people you don't even know. But if you're in relationship, if Fred and I are in relationship with each other, and I've been sharing my life with him, and he's been sharing his life with me, and we've been doing this for quite some time, and there's some trust. He's depending on my integrity. I'm depending on his integrity. There's some accountability. And then he sees me doing something that causes him to say, I have a responsibility to him. But to some passerby on the street, that's not what this is talking about. You understand this? Okay. I wanted to clear that up from the last time. Then he goes on in chapter 9, verse 1, and he says this. He says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. And then he says this. He says, this is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Okay, so apparently Paul is being criticized. Paul is receiving some criticism. What for? Let's read on. Verse 4. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do our other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas or Peter? Or is it only Barnabas and I who must work for a living? And then he gives several illustrations about soldiers deserving pay and farmers expecting grapes and flocks producing milk, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Verse 12 says, if others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? And so apparently, he's being criticized for receiving income for doing the work of the gospel. And what's fascinating here, it took me quite a while to figure out what was going on here. Paul is giving a very profound defense for why he should be entitled to receive income for the work that he's doing, but he's not even receiving any income for the work that he's doing. In other words, he's being accused for something he's not doing, even though he wants them to see, he wants them to see, even though he isn't doing it anyway, still he would be justified if he was. And then very fascinating, in the next sentence in verse 12, it says, but we did not use this right. We did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Verse 15, I have not used any of these rights, and I'm not writing now and hope that you will do such for me. I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of this boast. Yet, when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, for I am compelled to preach. I cannot boast, for I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel of Christ. So Paul has given up his rights voluntarily. Why? It has something to do with this gospel of Christ. We'll get to that. Now, down to verse 19. Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. So here we have a man who's given up his rights and surrendered his freedom. You know, isn't it interesting? I don't know about you, but I spent most of my young adult life scraping and clawing to get hold of my rights and to get free. I want to be free. I want to have the freedom to do things. I want my rights. And so Paul, ironically, the idea is his leadership in life, he has rights and he gives them up. Why? Look again at 12b. Rather than put up anything that might hinder the gospel of Christ. He gives up his rights because he doesn't want anything to hinder the gospel of Christ. And then secondly, over at verse 19, he's free. He doesn't belong to anyone. It's for freedom that Christ has set us free, and yet he surrenders his freedom. Why? To win as many as possible. It's interesting. Everything Paul does, everything is hyperbole, okay? But what Paul is doing, he does for the greater good of the gospel. Look further in verse 19. Verse 20. 4 groups: Jews, those under the law, those not under the law, and the oppressed in these next few verses. He says, to the Jews, I became like a Jew. To those under the law, I became like one under the law. Why? So as to win those under the law. He becomes like a Jew. He is a Jew. So, in his own culture, he acts like who he is so that he can win the Jews. When he's around those religious people that are under the law of Moses, he does many things in the Bible to fit in with those people. Why? So that he can win those people. You may recall he had Timothy circumcised. Even though circumcision is nothing, he still had him circumcised. Why? To win those for which that was important. And then when he went to Jerusalem, he had his head shaved and took a vow, paid for 4 other guys to have a vow taken. A Jewish deal. Why? Because he wanted to win as many as possible. He was a chameleon. He would change his colors to fit into the situation. Look at verse 21. To those not having the law, that would be the Gentiles, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law. Okay? So when I was out in the world, I fit in. I tried to fit in. I didn't violate my conscience. I didn't violate Christ's law, but I wanted to fit in. I wanted to fit in. Why? So that I might, win those not having the law. And then fourth, in verse 22, and to the weak I became weak. Why? To win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all means possible I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Wow. Interesting. Everything he was doing here in this text, he's doing for the greater good of the gospel. And that's what he wants us to see. It's very interesting because Paul in this text is talking about his life. In the chapters before and in the chapters after, he's talking about the Corinthians, but here he's talking about himself. This is who I am. I do everything for the sake of the gospel. I do everything for the sake of the greater good of the gospel. And that's the big idea today. It's all about the greater good of the gospel. You want to be a leader? This week, when you make your decisions, many of you already are leaders and you already do this. But for those of us who are still in pursuit of what does it mean to be a leader, here's one good test in this decision. What will constitute doing this for the greater good of the gospel? To the left or to the right? What will bring about the greater good of the gospel? This way or that way? When I first met Bill Bright in 1986, I was a young businessman wanting to do something great for God, not knowing what it was, looking for direction. And I heard him say these words. He said, I try to prioritize everything I do in light of the Great Commission. And I felt like 100,000 gigawatts just went through my body. It was so riveting. I said, that's it. That's it. It's all about the greater good of the gospel. That I will prioritize my life. I will make my decisions. I will choose my way on the basis of what's going to constitute the greater good of the gospel. In other words, it's not about my rights. I might have a right to win this argument. I might have a right to be treated with respect. I might have a right to be able to keep the deposit of the buyer that defaulted because their mother-in-law died and now they need the money for something else. I might have the right to it. But what is going to serve the greater good of the gospel? Yeah. I'm free. I can do anything I want. what's going to serve the greater good of the gospel? When we look at Paul's leadership, this is what we see. We see a man who voluntarily gives up his rights and surrenders his freedom for the greater good of the gospel. Look at what it said. It said, "Yet when I preach the gospel, I can't boast, for I am compelled to preach the gospel of Christ. Woe to me if I don't preach the gospel of Christ." The reason that he could give up his freedom, the reason that he could give up his rights, is because this man had been called by God. He had received a calling from God to do something to advance Christ's kingdom. And you want to know something? So have you. So have I. We all have received a calling to advance the gospel of Jesus, to advance the kingdom, to work for the greater good of the gospel. In everything. So, yeah, I have rights. Yeah, you have some rights. And it's nice every now and then to win one. But there's something higher. There's a higher value in the Christian life, and that is the greater good of the gospel. That by all means possible, we might save some. And so we live our lives, we see Paul living his life for the greater good of the gospel. And that's the way we're being called to live our lives too. I was watching a movie the other night, Navy SEALs. I think it was about 1990 movie. A helicopter had been downed, and the survivors were taken prisoner and taken to what was obviously a foreign country. So they called in the Navy SEALs to rescue them. And so after a blazing gun battle and the appropriate number of deaths and body parts, they were on the transport plane heading back to the United States, and one of the downed pilots says to the SEAL leader, he says, "Thank you, Lieutenant, for saving our lives. Thank you." And the lieutenant looks at him, he says, "Sir, there's no need to thank us because we don't exist. This never happened. You never saw us." And that's kind of the ethos of Paul. It's kind of the ethos of that I'm not looking for applause. I'm doing my duty. I'm a called man. I'm doing this for the greater good of the gospel. And then notice how he finishes off this text. Verse 24. "Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not box like a man beating against the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself might not be disqualified for the price." How do we live our lives for the greater good of the gospel? Can we even talk about this in our culture today? I go into strict training. I discipline myself. I don't do what I want to do. I don't lead the life of an individual. I do everything for the greater good of the gospel because it's all about the greater good of the gospel. I don't exercise my freedom. I don't exercise my rights. I surrender them. I give them up. Well, how do you do that? How do you do that? I went online and looked up the Navy SEALs workout. Pretty interesting. Running 5 days a week, total of 27 miles. On Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays, 20 sets of 20 push-ups. On Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 20 sets of 25 sit-ups. On Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 5 sets of 12 pull-ups. On Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 20 sets of 15 dips. And swimming continuously for 75 minutes, 4 to 5 days a week. That's strict training. That's discipline. That's how you get yourself to a place where you don't even exist. So how do you get yourself to a place where you don't even exist? It's all about the greater good of the gospel. I was mentioning this at a lunch table, this workout, and a young 14-year-old boy was sitting next to me, and he said, well, gosh, I guess I could never be a Navy SEAL. I said, that's not true. That's not true. You could do this because that's the last week of the workout. Let me read you the first week of the workout. In the first week of the workout, you run 2 miles at an 8.5-mile pace, 3 days. Anybody can do that. 4 sets of 15 push-ups, 3 days. 4 sets of 20 sit-ups, 3 days. 3 sets of 3 pull-ups for 3 days. And then swimming for 15 minutes continuously 4 or 5 days. Yeah, it's pretty hard. It would be pretty hard to do the full Navy SEAL workout. But it wouldn't be very hard to do the first step in the process of becoming a full-blown Navy SEAL. And so, some of us already make all of our decisions in light of the Great Commission. We're already doing what we do for the greater good of the gospel. Some are just kind of like, this is all like brand new, you know, we just, wow, man, I just became a Christian, and now I have to give up everything, and well, what's that all about? And everywhere in between. But what we all can do is we can all, if we desire to be compelled by the gospel, compelled by our calling to help other people discover what we've discovered, then what we really need to do is to look at Paul's life here. What we need to do today, there are other things you can do other days, but today what we can do is we can look at Paul's life and we can see, how did he get this way? Where we give up his rights, where he'd sacrifice his freedom. Well, he did it because of this compelling call. And the compelling call led him to discipline himself and to go into strict training. And we can do that too. And the amount of training that you do is not the amount of training that Paul did, but it's the amount of training you can handle today. What can you do today? What little decision is there today? What challenge do you face right now? What relationship are you worried about right now that you can say, okay, what would it look like for me to decide to do that which is all about the greater good of the gospel. Just take a few things. That's how you discipline yourself. Some in this room are already doing so much, are so far along in this, that they are tremendous models. I would encourage those of you who want to go further in this is to seek out these men at your tables. Take them to breakfast. Take them to lunch. Find out what makes them tick. Find out what makes them so committed to the greater good of the gospel. Why have they sacrificed so much for Christ? Why have they yielded so many rights for Christ? Why don't they promote themselves to the front? What is it about? What makes them tick? It's probably the same thing that makes Paul tick. It's all about the greater good of the gospel. That's what we want to imitate. Yes? Yes. Let's pray. Lord, when we look at this text, it is ironic that we see a man defending that which he has voluntarily given up. Lord, it incites us to see a man who says that he is compelled to preach the gospel. He is a Navy SEAL. He has trained himself. And Lord, I pray that you would help each of us to train ourselves to think this way. And if we don't want to do this, then Lord, help us to pray for the desire to want to do this, at least. And we ask this in your name, Jesus, for the greater good of your gospel. Amen.